So let's go ahead and record, and then I will share my screen. So what we're going to be going over object relationships in general today. One of my favorite topics of all time. I know it is a little bit hard to grasp object relationships when you start working through them, but at the end, like when all is said and done, they're going to make your life a lot easier as you go through the rest of the program. So they're a good thing to grasp. They'll keep coming up, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a little bit of a better understanding of object relationships in general. So at its core, all object relationships are really doing is giving us a way to connect two different objects. So it's really important that we first just understand objects. So you can see I have two classes created here, a dog class and a person class. And just so we get a little bit of a chance to review, I have a few questions for you. So to start, taking a look at our dog class, what are, and you can list them off in the chat or you can say them out loud, for our dog class, what are the instance methods we have available to us? Give me an instance method we have available to us in the dog class. Okay, and we mentioned breed and name, and it is important. Both of those are methods that we have for our dog class. That means that we could come down here and we could say dog.breed, because dog is an instance, and we could also come down here and say dog.name. Both of those are going to run without giving us an error. What is the other method called that still is going to be kind of using breed and name? There's another one that goes off of there. Add@all is a class variable and pretty important too. But what I was trying to get at is, yes, these are both methods, but don't forget that like when we put attribute accessor here, this line of code is writing 4 methods for us. And it is important that we realize that it's actually writing 4 full methods that we could make use of. And so we also have the ability to change someone's breed. We can set this to like be a golden or something like that, or we have the ability to change someone's name. The other question, and I think some of you guys might have jumped ahead on this one, is what class methods do I have available for my dog class? Oh, I see it in the chat. We've got .all. So .all is a class method that we have available. And then there are some just built into classes in general. So like we have the .new method, which will call upon our initialize. So we come with a few built in. The reason I wanted to cover that is because when we start by defining these relationships between a dog and a person, at the bare bones, what we're really doing is we're making methods or instance methods that allow a dog to keep track of who their owner is, or allows us to have some sort of a relationship. So our first task of the day is just to talk about a belongs to relationship. And the one thing I like about this is we can really think about it in real world. Like I have a dog, my dog belongs to me. I have the ability to have many dogs, but my dog is only going to belong to one person. So in this case, we are going to set up a belongs to relationship where our dog is going to belong to a person. We have the option here, and it's your choice when you're defining a lot of these. I could say it belongs, or what the test tells you to, I guess. When you have tests, you don't have as much of a choice. We could say it belongs to a person, or we could say it belongs to an owner. You can call it what you want. For now, we'll say it belongs to a person. So, and I know we've got a lot in the chat. I'm curious if anyone is feeling bold. If I wanted to just set up the fact that a dog could now be owned by a person, that belongs to a person, what would I need to add to this class to make that possible?
You would need an owner, accessor, I think.
Yeah, so at the bare bones, just like our dog has a name, like, and we can say what the dog's name is with the attribute accessor, just like our dog has a breed, we would add another attribute to keep track of that. And this is where I was saying it's kind of your choice what you want to call it. So I see a lot of people mentioning owner, so let's just call it an owner. Uh-oh. And this at the bare bones does get our job done. Because now I can say something like puppy.owner equals, remember this is giving me both the reader and the writer, so it does give me this instance method, equals Jen. And I can write it with the space or I can write it that way, it doesn't matter. But we now have this method, and if we looked at it, and it's going to give us the same return value, our puppy now has an owner. The cool part is this is an object itself. And so at the bare bones, when we set up a belongs to, we are just saying that we have an attribute that's going to store the value of another class. And then because it's storing the value of another object, this is still an object. Like this as its whole, you can see in the output, is an object, which means we can do things like add .name to the end of it. And we actually will get back a string. So any instance methods available to our person are now able to be called on our owner. There is one thing I do want to point out is that at the bare bones, yes, this gets it done. There is a little bit that you might want to account for in protections later on. This isn't something that you necessarily have to deal with in the labs, because usually the labs are pretty good about, they'll send you an object. But if someone was trying to use your program and they accidentally sent in a string rather than a variable that represented an instance, what would happen? When I hit run, what are we going to see?
It's just going to assign the string to it.
Yeah, it's going to assign the string to it. And then I think someone else was trying to say something.
Maybe a type error.
Yeah, so we're going to get some sort of error because, like Mike said, it's just going to be assigning the string to it. And so what's going to happen is we'll actually see, I think, a undefined method or a no method error. These errors usually don't say the no method, but this is essentially a no method error. We don't have a method called name for a string. We only have a method called name for an object, or for a person object in particular. And so there are ways that you could add like a protection around this if you wanted to. And I'm going to show you how, just because I think it is interesting to think that way. You don't need to necessarily do this in your labs because, like I said, your tests are pretty good about they'll send in the right thing. And so because all this is an attribute accessor, at the end of the day, all that is are two methods. We have this method that's going to return our owner, our reader, and then at the other hand, we also have our writer method. And I'm going to write it like this. We can call whatever this argument is in the parentheses whatever we want. I'm trying to remind myself that I'm looking for an object to be passed in. And so at the bare bones, what we had initially set up was this is all that was happening. Is we were just assigning value to that instance variable. Same thing would happen. We would get the same error in here if we run it like this. What we can do though, is there's actually a way that we can check for what is the class. So you see how this is saying that the class is a string. We can do, let's turn this back to the normal way. We can check like, okay, what is the class that got assigned right here? And we can see that it was a person. When this was a string and we check for the class, we're going to see that our output is a string. And this is a built-in Ruby method. We don't ever have to write this. It's just the ability, if we want to check what the value is of something, this is a good way to check what it is. So if I wanted to add a protection in here, I might be able to say something like only if my owner object, oh, that is not right. My owner object has a class equal to a person. And this is like a weird, like, I think this throws people off when they see this here, but I'm taking exactly what I saw as my output. One reason we tell you never to define variables with a capital letter is because Ruby reads those to be class level variables. So it is specifically, it knows that this is a class, it is not a string, it is not a variable. So we can say if those are equal, then assign our owner. Just as like an extra check, because this time, what's gonna happen when I do, let's leave it as class. What do you think is gonna happen this time?
It's gonna be nil, maybe?
That's a good guess. Yeah. And so this is a way that we can like protect it from accidentally assigning it to anything other than an object. Again, this is not necessarily, this extra part is not necessarily something you have to include in your code. I just like to make the point of it would throw off your code if someone passed in a string rather than an object, and there is the way to make sure it is an object as we start dealing with that belongs to relationship. The other thing that we see is this is still going to break if I put .name here, because now we have undefined method name for nil class. And this error, I am just going to tell you, I guarantee every single one of you guys will have this at some point in your code, either in this section, Sinatra, or Rails. Because it is common that you might accidentally think you have a relationship set up. You try to call the name and there's no relationship set up yet. And so one way, and a lot of your labs have covered this, maybe not a lot of your labs, but one way to handle this is we could actually make a separate instance method that returns the owner's name. I think there's one where you have to return the artist's name. And the reason we might do this is because then we can add in a check that says, if there is an owner, then do owner.name, so that we don't end up with an error when we want to call the owner's name. And so now when I call owner name, it's not going to ever give us an undefined method for nil class. It's just not going to return anything because it doesn't have a name, which is fair. Another way of writing this, and it's more just because I want to show you guys a few techniques, is we can also like try to call this method. So the same way of writing this is we can say at owner.try, and then we pass in as a symbol the method that we're trying to call. And what this really fancy method does is it basically says, if this method doesn't throw an error, if owner.name does not throw an error, then I will do owner.name. If owner.name does throw an error, then I won't do it and I'll just return nil. And so it's basically the same code that we wrote up here. Oh, that did not work. Undefined method try for nil class. Does try only work?
Jen, you're calling it on an
I'm doing
no.
it on the wrong way. No, I need to be doing it like, I know. Shoot, I would have to do it like this instead. Which goes away from it and is not. But that should, try isn't, the whole point is that you're supposed to be able to use try on a nil class. Maybe it's just try not get defined until we get to active record. Is that the problem? Yes. Yep. So you can ignore everything I just said about try. I apologize, folks. This is what happens when you go past and then you come back. So we'll just write out our own special way. At least you tried. That's a good one, Ken. It will be something that comes back up, and we can reference this and we can see. So instead of showing you other fancy techniques, Let's go back to now we've got a different relationship set up, and we'll continue to set up the other half of this, because that's really the important part here. So we have our belongs to relationship set up. Like I said, we can write out this whole thing, or we could have just done it as an attribute accessor. You don't need to break your back over doing a belongs to relationship. Now, how do we set up the other side? So our dog, as you can see, our dog knows about its owner. Our puppy's owner name is Jen. Does Jen know about its dog? So if I said Jen.dogs, am I going to get anything back? How do I start to fix this? Because I really would like to see Jen.dogs, and I would like to see a list of all of the dogs that Jen owns. At the bare bones, how would you just go about fixing this error that we see in our terminal?
Referencing.
You would.
Go ahead. Make the dog methods in person and reference the all global dog.
Okay, so
Sorry, class instance, not global.
So I think this is kind of what you're saying is at the very bare bones, if we just want to go one line at a time and solve this, we would need a method that just says dogs. So kind of like going back to what Avi said, like we'll go one error at a time. So we would need some method that is going to return all of the dogs. Now there has been a way that your curriculum is going to show you how to do this, and there is like another way that I'm going to point you to doing it. We're going to go over both quickly. Not quickly, I've got it chunked, so we'll cover both in time. But a lot of your labs are setting it up so that this is going to work like a normal reader and just returns the @dogs variable. In which case, it is really important that each person starts with @dogs being a variable that is an array that we could add dogs to. So we would start with something like this. So at the bare bones, when I run this now, we're going to get back an empty array. So we've told the puppy about its owner, and we call Jen dogs. It still doesn't know about its dog here. One way to solve this is in here when we actually assign our owner, and I'm going to just comment this out, and we're going to deal with the main code so I don't throw you off of the parts we really need. After we assign who owns the dog, it's important that we also tell the owner about the dog, because there needs to be some reciprocity. So one thing that we could do is this is literally a person instance. Because it is a person instance, I have all person instance methods available to me. At the moment, what are the instance methods that I have available in the person class? We went over this at the very beginning. We've got, so we still have name equals, and then we also now have dogs. So because we now have dogs, and this is an instance of the person, I can call owner.dogs, and it would give me this empty array. And I could technically add or shovel some dogs into that array. What keyword here would represent the current dog that we're dealing with?
Self.
Yeah, if you ever hear someone say like in Ruby in this part, like the current dog or that exact instance we're talking about, or itself, self will be our keyword. And so now when we run it again, Jen does know about her dog. So we end up with this cool relationship where when I just tell a dog about its owner automatically knows about their dog. Where this gets a little bit tricky is when we start to talk about transferring ownership. And so where this gets a little bit tricky is if I go through and I say, okay, well, actually, let me make another person. Make a person called Bob. And maybe Bob comes and steals my puppy. So we're going to change this to now the puppy's owner is actually Bob. Will the puppy still be in my dogs? What do we think? Yes, no. We got one yes. See a few head nods. Well, maybe a lot of I don't knows. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll run it. I still see my puppy here that doesn't have a name yet. I just got him and Bob stole him. But look, it actually says that the dog's owner is Bob. And if we were to look at Bob's dogs, would I see the dog in Bob's dogs? Maybe. I feel like everyone's scared to make a guess. Yes, we would see the owner in Bob. We would see the dog in Bob's dogs as well. And if we were to ask the puppy, who's your owner? The puppy is going to tell us that his owner is Bob. So this is a problem because we want all of our people to agree on who owns them. And this way of dealing with it, where we shoveled it into here, a lot of the labs are set up for this to work and actually kind of point you in kind of dealing in this way because I think it's easy to think about it. But big picture, this is a problem. We never want a system where one person, two different people are arguing about who has ownership over the dog. And Lucy gave us a solution. Yes, so there are some solutions to make this work. One would be every time we call this method, we could first see if we could basically do a check to delete the dog from the owner's dog if it's being reassigned. So like there's a lot of logic that we could end up writing out in here in order to make this work and delete it from one and transfer ownership to the other. It gets really messy fast. I'll just go ahead and tell you that. So what we come to is this like big principle that we call our single source of truth. I'm just trying to think of an analogy for it today. And I used to be a school teacher, and I would say, kind of reminds me of when multiple people might claim ownership over like, that phone is mine, that phone is mine, like, you know, he took my phone. It's like, well, let's look at the phone and see in the phone who actually is listed as the owner. So what we want is we always want the thing that can only have one thing. So like the belongs to, our dog can only belong to one owner, whereas our owner could have many dogs. You know, you could come up to the student and say, I saw you with a different phone, and they could say, well, I have two phones, this is my phone. It's a much more definitive argument if we give our truth teller, or the person that actually is going to keep track of the relationship, is going to be the belongs to side, because there's only one owner that they can have. So the way we think about this instead is, instead of carrying around this array that we constantly are adding and deleting to and messing with, what we think about instead is we actually want to make sure that instead of just messing with this array, that every time we're grabbing the dogs from all of the dogs and just pulling out the ones that have our name as their owner. And I don't know what that is. Hopefully it's not deleting everything. So that's our big focus, is we want only one side to really be changing or dealing with the relationship or recording the relationship. And then we want the other side, our person, to be looking at the dog class to see which dogs are mine. So I know I've worked with a few of you guys on this, and some of you might have figured it out on your own, but what would that code look like if I wanted to look at, and let me kind of write out the pseudocode. I want to look at all the dogs, and basically I want to find the dogs that are mine, or that list me as their owner. I'll say that lists me as their owner. What would, and I know it's a little hard to see with the light gray, but what would that look like if I tried to actually code that out?
It would be a dogs all and select.
We got a lot of code coming into the chat. So yeah, we would basically, this grabs all of the dogs. So And this only works because I had already set up our self.all. If we didn't have this, we would need to create this method, because this method gives us access to our class variable that holds all of the dogs. So this selects all of the dogs, and then we go through and we would want to use a keyword that's going to return all of them. And so there's two keywords that you could use for that. We could either do find_all, or we could use select. And then we would set up code that basically is going to look at each dog. And when we look at each dog, we use the reader method to say, who's your owner? And we check it to be itself. It's important to realize this right here is going to be a person object or a person instance. This right here will also be a person instance. And so we compare these two and we grab our dogs that way. If you want to save them as an instance variable, you can. It's not as crucial that we do that, because it's probably better that we just call dogs every time, so in case other dogs have been added. So it could be written like this, or we could deal without an instance variable and just call this instance method from other places in our code if we wanted to do some other things with our dogs. So with just that in play, is that going to change our output that we see when I look at Jen's dogs and Bob's dogs? What do we think? Let's try it. So remember, our puppy has been stolen by Bob. Will our puppy show up in Jen's dogs? Give me your vote. What do you think? You can be wrong. You can even in the chat just message me directly if you don't want someone to see your guess. Okay, I see some head shakes. I know we don't have that many in there. It's really like hard to know, will the puppy still be in Jen's dogs? So it's kind of like think, well, let's run it and we'll see what happens, and then we'll think through the code. So our puppy is not in Jen's dogs anymore. And that is kind of surprising, because before it was. The reason it's not in Jen's dogs anymore is because the way we're grabbing the dogs is we're now specifically looking at the dog class and we're asking the dog, who is your owner? And so in this case, we're looking and we're seeing, okay, well, who was their last owner? It didn't matter that their owner was Jen. We transferred ownership on line 52. And so this method basically looked at all the dogs and tried to find anyone with the dog owner of Jen. And then if we put this back and we take a look at Bob's dogs, he will have the dog in there, and our puppy owner will say Bob. So now we have this thing where no matter what we do, no matter how many times we transfer ownership, we should always be getting back the right owner and the right set of dogs. Because we've switched to this idea of a single source of truth, where our only truth is coming through our dog class. So I want to give them, this is like, I feel like it takes a lot to digest this, and there's a lot of pieces that we kind of have gone over, and there's other portions I want to talk about. But before we move forward, what I want to know is, are there questions, especially from some of you guys who might have done it a different way before? Anyone have any questions before we move on? Okay, so moving on from here, one method that we haven't really dealt with yet, and one thing that throws us off here is before, and this is the big change, before I was able to say like, oh, let's add the dog to Jen's dogs. Does this code really work anymore? What do we think? Is this going to work? No. So this is why, and actually a lot of the labs have pointed to this, is typically we aren't going to add dogs in this method. Instead, we'll write a separate method to add a dog. So we'll actually add like add dog, or we could call it adopt or something like that. In this case, adopt makes sense, but in other ones it might need to be add dog. Let me change it because that's more universal. And then we would actually go in and we would write a method to deal with that. And that is why a lot of the labs handle this separately and don't just want you to shovel in dogs. They actually want a method that takes care of it for you. And we'll call this a dog object again. What would I need to do in the dog object to save the fact that Jen now owns this dog? This is like a big question. So we can kind of even talk through it. Like I like hearing your guys' thoughts. What would we need to do here so that we are saving the fact that Jen just adopted this dog? Ah, I see, Lucy. Good, great point. So we cannot, if you notice, we no longer can just do something like this, even in the inside of here, which is this might be what you've been doing before. There's nothing wrong with that. But once we start dealing with a single source of truth, we don't have an instance variable in our person that's keeping track of the dogs. We're keeping track and we're saving and storing the relationship always in the dog class, which means that we need to look at our dog object, and this is an object, so I can call any instance method that we have on it, and we have an instance method called owner equals, so I can set the owner. So I can take my dog and I can tell it, here, you have an owner now. Your owner is now going to be the person who is currently adding the dog. Who would that person be that's currently adding the dog? Thank you. I see it in the chat. We've got self. And so self right here is going to be representing Jen, which just is a person object. So we're basically setting the dog object owner to be self or to be Jen. Now to see if this works, we'll take a look at Jen's dogs and we'll see if he's in there. And then let's double check to make sure that the dog knows about their owner. Cool, and we can try name and we can see that then we get it away from an object and we get it just to be a string. So there was a lot that kind of went in on that, and I know, Lucy, you gave us the code in the chat, but I'd love to hear one of you guys. I think it takes a bit to understand why this works, why telling the dog about its owner establishes that relationship firmly. Either Lucy or someone else that feels confident in it, do you want to explain why this works, especially if maybe previously you were operating in this way, and maybe why this doesn't work in this situation?
I was actually doing kind of a mix of the two. I was not using the select method in dogs, but I was, whenever I added a dog, I was calling this owner equals method, and I had actually changed the owners equals method the way that you had at first to add new dogs into the array. So I was doing sort of a mix of those two, but I think the reason why it works here is because when we call the owner equals method on dog object, it's basically like every dog has an instance variable owner, and you're saying that instance variable equals whatever person object is calling it. So you're going back to this owners equals method and you're setting that instance variable of that dog to equal you. And because you did that in the array of all dogs, that dog is going to be in there, and the owner of that dog is going to be you.
Yeah, it's kind of, I feel like you did a great job. It's kind of like this circular wheel of like, okay, so this is the person, which means that the owner object set in here is the person. So we set the owner to be the person, and that's how we select our dogs. It is kind of this wheel, but the most important part and the thing that I'm trying to emphasize is always it's the class that is on the belongs to side that is going to be keeping track of your information, so that you have one place that stores all of your information that is really useful to access. Again, I want to emphasize there are not any like silly questions in here. This takes a while to get. And so I just want to give you guys a second if you do have any questions. Otherwise, we'll move on and we'll take a look at like how do you do another connection here and kind of move on to has many through. Any questions? Okay. So some of you guys might not have gotten there yet, but one of the next steps we'll talk about is having even another relationship in this system. So dog is kind of our main point of truth. It belongs to an owner. But let's say before we adopted the dog, we had another class, and we had a class of shelter. And the dogs, before they belonged to an owner, or maybe sadly after they belonged to an owner, they also belonged to a shelter. So there's two relationships that our dog class is going to have, and one is it belongs to an owner, and one is it belongs to a shelter. And so inside of this shelter class, we'll just have a few attributes. Let's do an attribute of name, and then we'll also say maybe location, we'll say city, I don't know. Just something else to give it a little bit more information in here. And then beyond that, at the moment, we'll just leave it as is. So now we can actually go down here and we can make a shelter. I can spell shelter correctly. And I'll save it as an S. And so for our shelter, we'll give it a name of the Humane Society. This is actually where I got my dog. And we'll give it a location of Nashville, Tennessee, because that is also where I actually got my dog. And now we have a shelter in here as well. Except for I called it city and not location. And that would make a difference. Cool. So now that we have a shelter, I also want to, basically this first part is going to be you guys talking me through it. So I want to make sure you got what we were dealing with. Bare bones, we're going to go the easiest way possible. How do I set it up so that my dog belongs to a shelter? Last time we did kind of the long way. What's the easiest way to make it so that a dog belongs to a shelter? I don't know if we're all so quiet because we're scared to talk or if we don't know the answer.
The dog class would need a shelter writer and reader, or
Yeah, so the simplest way, and I know last time we started the simplest way, is just to add it as an attribute. It is at the bare bones that belongs to is just another attribute. But what that, I put that in the wrong spot. No one had called me on that yet. The bare bones, all it is it's an attribute that we're able to set equal to an object. So now we could say, we could take this first dog and we could say dog.shelter equals S. And if we take a look at our dog, we would see, okay, look, there is an object in here called shelter, and we can see it's the Humane Society of Nashville. So we are storing that information in here. We can either then do, I always spell shelter wrong, so I apologize. We can even do that in here as well. So we can see it knows about its shelter. That's the easy part. How do I set it up so that our shelter has many dogs? And think about bare bones again. I want to be able to call s.dogs and not have this error. At the most bare bones basic, how do I make it so that we don't see this undefined method dogs?
you need a class method called dogs.
Okay. Does everyone agree with that?
The instance method.
And it gets really confusing. The only reason it's not a class method is it's because each shelter has a set of many dogs. So I know like for add at all, that one's a class method because has many, but it's instead of thinking about if it's containing many or one, it's more like, does it apply to one instance or does it apply to all of the instances? And in this case, each shelter could have its own set of dogs. We've only created one shelter, but we potentially could have many shelters. And so here we have our instance method that will get rid of our error, but it still isn't going to give us any information. What is my code that belongs in here to set up my has many relationship?
You could do a select all on the all class of dog,
So
or
once
the all method.
Once we get this down, it's going to be pretty similar in all of these. So if you're writing this for the first time, I'd recommend maybe just typing it every time, but I've written it a few times, and so for the sake of me just not mistyping it, we're going to copy it over and then change the one piece that really matters. And this time we are looking to select the shelter. If I can spell that correctly. So instead of selecting the dog's owner that matches self, now we're looking for the dog's shelter that matches self. And this one setup, a line of code, is going to give us all of the information that we need to be able to actually now print out our shelter.dogs. And if we want to look at it a little bit closely, we can say this is an array. So we can say shelter.dogs first, and then we get our first dog, and then we could do .name, and we should see Toby. So this is reporting back an array of all of the dogs that have been added to this shelter. And at the bare bones, that is really all you need to set up that relationship. If we wanted to have the ability to add a dog to it, which we might, it's going to work very similarly as well. And so as we go through and we add a dog object to this, same thing is we really want to be telling the dog about the shelter. Our dog holds all information. I just want to make that really, really super important. And it's purely because it's the one with the belongs to side of the relationship. So what I would do is I would, instead of telling the shelter about the dog, I'm going to take this dog object and I'm going to tell it about its shelter. And that will be our current shelter or our self. And so this is another way that we can add dogs to it. And so let's come through and we'll say shelter.add dog, and we'll add our puppy. And so now we should see that there are 2 dogs in here if we've done it correctly. Perfect. And if we got rid of that, we would see both of our dogs in here. Yeah, so there's our name Toby, and there's our second dog, and the name is unknown. Perfect. Okay, so now we get to the real fun part and the tricky part. I adopted my dog, and my dog came from the Humane Society or a shelter. How could I figure out, and maybe I've adopted many dogs and all of my dogs have come from different shelters. So there is this possibility that I might have a relationship to the shelter, and it's not a direct relationship, but it's a relationship because I got a dog who had a relationship with the shelter. Kind of like those, third cousins or something like that. You have a relation to them, but not a direct relation. How would I access, thinking about it here, so we've got a person, and our person has a dog, and that dog is related to a shelter. How would I figure out all of the shelters that I've ever gotten dogs from? And so I want to come down here and be able to do gen.shelters. And I know you might say, like, would this be plural or singular? It would be plural because there is the possibility that I have 5 dogs and each dog came from a different shelter. And so by default, this is what we call our has many through, because there is the possibility that I have many dogs and each dog belongs to a different shelter. And so I, by default, then I have many dogs through, or I have many shelters through my dog. Now this is a really tricky part. Well, someone kind of, Nelson, I think is throwing out the answers at me. I was gonna have us pseudocode it a little bit. But so we'll still give the pseudocode and then we can put that piece in there. So pseudocode wise, what we want to look at is we want to basically look at all of my dogs. So not all the dogs in general, but just specifically all of my dogs. And then grab each shelter for each dog. So each dog has a relationship with a shelter, and Nelson did give us some really nice code in there that says dogs.collect. And I should have just copied and pasted it, but I want to talk through what this is doing. What is it, when I say dogs, what method is that calling right there?
The instance method of dogs, so like whatever owner it is, their collection of dogs.
Yeah, so it's collecting our individual collection, because the way these instance methods read, if we don't have a word in front of it, it by default puts the word self in front of it. So it's as if, like when I call gen.shelters, and this is what I tell people, self always represents the object that our method was called on. So if shelters was called on gen, then self represents gen, which means that we're looking at Jen's dogs. That's in essence what this is saying. And then the reason we would use collect or map here is that's just going to actually replace, instead of it being an array of dogs, it will now be an array of shelters. So let's see if this worked. We should get the Humane Society back on here. Perfect. And it would be an array because there's the possibility that we would have more than one shelter. What if we have, what if we also adopted the puppy? So we're going to steal our puppy back. So I'm going to add a dog and we're going to put it as the puppy. What will I see in gen.shelters now? Take a second to look at it because there's a lot that happens. So this shelter, we have added the dog to it and we've added the puppy. How many shelters will I now have in my array? Two, but they're the same. Perfect. So depending on how you want your code to run, or depending on what the tests are asking, you might want a repeat, because you might want to do something to say like how many, like the one that's like genre count or something like that. You might want to grab a count of how many shelters do I have that are the same? How many times have I adopted a dog from the Humane Society? Or you might actually want this to be a unique collection. How could I simply turn this into a unique collection?
Add dot unique.
Yeah, so we can just add dot unique to the end here. And I do want to point out this method chaining sometimes looks a little bit confusing. It really is just adding this method to the end or to the return value of this. And it still works if this was a do and an end block. So if we had written our code like this, the dot unique could still be attached to the end, because it's as if you're just attaching it to the end of a curly bracket. Just to kind of point out that side note. We could do this for the opposite side as well. So we could also look at our shelters and we could make a has many through to our persons, and end up collecting all of the people who have adopted our dogs. They both are going to work the same way. I do want to know, I really feel like sometimes this is a little bit hard to grasp. I kind of want to get a gauge from you guys, and you can feel free to ask questions too, but can you just put in the chat, I know I've asked questions like this before, how are you feeling about these relationships that we covered today? Scale of 1 to 5, 5 being like, let me take over, I can teach this lecture. 1 being like, what's an object relationship? Are you sure you talked about that? Where are we? 3 being like, I think I got it, but I still have a few questions. Because it takes a while to get, and I will say that to you guys. Okay, cool. We're all over the map. Can I ask one of you guys that's kind of in the like starting to get it to range, are there any specific questions or pieces that really throw you off as you go through this? Anyone be brave and share their thoughts? I'm sure someone has a similar thought.
Jen, I can share something that maybe others can relate to. I was talking to Jess this morning and I was just saying this feels really, really abstract to me, and it's hard to visualize it. And I think what we were doing even last week, I felt way more comfortable, and this week everything feels a little more confusing because it's so like in the cloud. So that's why it's been so hard for me. And even hearing you say it, like this is the second time you've gone through it for me, and I'm still like, have I heard this before? So yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I think of it and as like, I try to like actually, not, I don't know if this really helps going to code, but I try to like envision or use, like in this example, like it's really easy for me to think about like, my dog belongs to me. And when he belongs to me, I want to automatically know that I am his owner, you know, like that relationship. But I agree that I think it's a little bit hard to understand. One thing that you will get to databases in the next section. And for some reason, for me, it clicked a lot better when I started thinking about it in terms of tables. And I think everyone thinks in different ways. So to give one other example of how how to think about it is if we were thinking about like we're keeping track of all of our dog objects in a table. So let's just say we have a table, and these aren't very straight lines, and we've got, you know, dog 1 is listed here, and we have a table where we keep track of their attributes. So here is like their name, probably would be better if I was typing. Here is like their breed. We've got a spot to keep track of their owner over here. And that's where we'll list, this is so poorly written, and this is where we'll list who their owner is. The reason we want the dog to keep track of it is because if we were to make this same exact table for an owner, we wouldn't like have one column to put one dog. We would have to do as many columns as we had dogs. So we would need, like, because if we think of each spot as only holding one piece of information, like each of these only has a slot for one piece of information. If we look at it on the other side as an owner table, we would have like our person, we're just gonna put person because I can't write that much. Here's their name, and so we would have to do like, oh, dog 1, dog 2, because we don't have the ability to store an array. We have to just do one piece of information at a time, and it gets quite like, you don't know how many dogs you're going to have. You want it to be open to endless possibilities, which is why we make sure that the belongs to side of it is the side that is storing, or the keeper of all information. And yeah, I would say that like what Chris said in there too, like some of them do make sense and some are a little bit more abstract. And so that is a little bit harder to think about. Another thing that I really like in thinking about kind of visually is if we think of our object as having lots of attributes, like if our dog has all of these attributes, it's almost like a subset kind of, that's not, like our dog can have a name, a breed, an owner. We could just list the owner as a string. Like that is a possibility, but we want to be able to store even more information on there, which is why instead of just pointing to, where are we? Instead of just listing like the owner as equal to like a string, we actually want to specify that this is like an owner object. And so I think of it as like everything else, I'm assigning a name equal to a string, I'm assigning like a breed equal to a string, and then it's like I'm assigning the owner equal to like I don't know why, but I think of it in like boxes. Like I'm assigning it to this whole other box that contains information. And that's just like one way that I go about it. And so I would say for now, if you kind of have down the process, like if you notice like the process, once you get it down, is fairly similar of for a belongs to, we include an attribute. For the has many, we're gonna basically look over at the belongs to and select all of the matches. At the bare bones, if you can kind of start by processing like the how, I feel like the why starts to come as you do. Like every time you get down the how, then trying to go back through and be like, let me write out the pseudocode for what my code is saying. Because this is one thing that I think the why comes with, it does come over time. I don't know. But thank you, Anna, for sharing that. I think that's really true. It's like the more you see it, the easier it gets, but it's just a hard thing to grasp at first. Chris, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, again, this is a tricky topic to cover, and during your one-on-ones this week, Jen and I have so many examples and things we can walk through with you to kind of help you grasp it more. And I think it is helpful to try to start with the more like real life practical ones like we did today. But I think the other thing to kind of echo is if it doesn't make sense to you right now, I think this last point that Jen was bringing up is really important because we're trying to get you starting to think about how databases work. And we haven't even really touched on databases yet, so we're trying to build a bridge, but we can't, right now you can't really see where the bridge is going. But once you get to the other side, you'll see that there's a reason for all of this. So just stick with it.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
So I understand we have the has many relationship, and the has many naturally coincides with the belongs to. And in doing so, there is a responsibility, right? A single source of truth.
Yes.
Now, in saying that, the single source of truth in the has to and belongs to method would be, in this case, well, the person is the has to, and then the belongs to is the dog, right?
Correct.
So in that particular case, of course, I definitely understand the single source of truth is the dog. So we always have to ask the dog for information, even through the class person, because again, the dog holds the truth, right?
Yes. Yes.
So now bridging over to the next concept of relationships. Now we're going into the has through.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I guess, as you mentioned, the real life situation is we go to the dog shelter, right? The person goes to the shelter to get a dog. The dog, I mean, he didn't want to go to the shelter, but he went to the shelter somehow as well too, you know? And it's only through the shelter was the person able to get the dog.
So
And through the shelter, the dog somehow was able to be joined to the person. So in this case, would the single source of truth be the shelter? In this particular, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think, and this is my fault. I'm glad you said that. So the through is actually the dogs here. Yes, you're right. The person has to go to the shelter to get the dog and to drop off the dog. But I was thinking of it more in the sense, and this goes back to the databases, but the thing that you're going through always has to be the thing of truth and the thing that has specific belongs to relationships. And the reason is because I could never access the dog. Like, yes, I literally go to the shelter and I get the dog through the shelter. But my shelter has many dogs. And so I couldn't which dog is yours? So it's more so like, I'm thinking about this, like I've adopted my dog, but I still have like a relationship with that shelter or want a feeling of goodwill towards that shelter because I got my dog and my dog is my connection to that shelter. So in that sense, maybe this was a bad example to use, because really the through is the dog, because the through is going to be whatever is your thing that has two belongs to relationships. Like by definition, that's what makes it a through relationship, is it has two belongs to relationship. So it has a way to connect.
So another quick question then. I know we are pressed for time, but another quick question. Let's say, you know, I believe Chris shared something like this with me before. So so when we are talking about a rider, right? An Uber driver, right? An
Mhm.
Uber driver has many people that they have to pick up sometimes, right?
Mhm.
And then those people, sometimes they have many drivers sometimes to pick them up. So at that point, we kind of try to establish, okay, what is the point in connecting those two, right? Because both of them has a many relationship.
Mhm.
And in that case, he mentioned using rides to be that connection, because through the rides, they're able to both connect. Now, I was thinking the same thing as it came to this. It's only through the shelter that they're both able to connect. So, for
Well,
example, in the shelter, if we were able to make a method called, you know, I don't know, adopt or transaction or something like that, you would probably have maybe, I don't know, information for the initialization portion, maybe a price, a instance of the person, and the instance of that dog. And at that point, now within the shelter, you have a single source of truth, because now you have both entities, that instance of the dog, that instance of the shelter, and the transaction all saved with inside of the shelter information, right?
Um,
and can I add something?
yes.
So Nathalbert, okay, you could go as a person to 10 different shelters before you pick a dog, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going to the shelter doesn't necessarily give you the relationship. It's once you adopt the dog, you say, oh, I got this dog from this shelter. It's like Jen was saying, if she has 3 dogs and all the dogs came from different shelters, then because she picked that dog and that dog belonged to that shelter previously, that's the shelter that she actually, you know, that's the shelter that's connected to her. You're right conceptually that there is the shelter is where you have to go, but it's not until you actually get the dog that you have that connection. You can visit like 10 or 15 shelters before you pick one dog.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you have 15 shelters now. Now you still only have one shelter because you only bought one dog from one shelter.
It's also, at the end of the day, you have to think about where can you create a belongs to, because you need the belongs to for the truth. And you're right, you could create something like an adoption class that keeps track of that.
Mm-hmm.
But for this sake, you don't necessarily need to, because our dog already has the information.
And we could
because
put all those attributes on the dog. We could say, how much was this dog purchased for or adopted for, right? The dog table still could have all of that information.
Mm-hmm.
Because a shelter at the end of the day has many dogs and has many people adopting dogs. And so because those are both has manys, you want to try to find the belongs to is where your through is always going to be.
Okay, so the belongs to is always your thing. Okay, let me think about that.
Yeah. And it is like Chris said, like it is something that we can also definitely discuss in one-on-ones more, because I think it takes a little bit than just like one big lecture on it to like have everything fully click. So, and maybe this was that all examples, like you can kind of get them to fit different things if you want to. And so I'm sorry if I threw you off by this example. But.
No problem. I appreciate it.
Cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end this because we are at time. If you guys do have any follow-up questions, bring them up in your one-on-one or put them in the technical questions channel and we'd be happy to discuss. I sent out the code to you guys in the chat, so just make sure to grab that before you leave, and it will be posted where we post all of the videos as well. So, bye guys.